ADA 30 Idaho. Interview Series. Melva Heinrich, interviewed by Mark Leeper.
So hello everyone. Good to see you again on another issue of the ADA 30 Idaho interview series as part of Idaho's ADA 30th anniversary celebration, kind of ongoing. We've been really pleased to be able to talk to some folks in the independent living movement and dealing with the Americans with Disabilities Act and various things that are important to people with disabilities being able to access the communities in which they live. I wanted to remind viewers to find these videos and other information on the Facebook page for Idaho Hens Around the Capitol. You'll find this, and as I say, the other interviews. There have been some fascinating looks at people's lives and the difference the Americans with Disabilities Act has made for them and the possibilities that it continues to offer. Today, we're really pleased to have Melva Heinrich from Living Independence Network Corporation, Twin Falls office. Kind of, I call her LINC's do-it-all person. And I'm sure sometimes she probably feels like she's done it all because we've kind of been doing this for a little while. But we're going to be talking about transportation. And certainly, transportation is one of those interesting things and one of the most visible things that the Americans with Disabilities Act was intended to address. I always find it's fascinating because when you look at groups like ADAPT, their beginnings were focused on transportation, trying to get Section 504 regulations in place for transportation. So it was Americans with disabilities for accessible accessible public transportation. Sorry, we get a little tongue-tied. There's been too many acronyms over the years. But anyway, they've changed over the time. But early on, they're noted for having the Gang of 19 that held demonstrations in Denver, Colorado, and to make the buses accessible. Denver was one of the early ones to have accessible buses as a result. So when the ADA came around, it was kind of the icing on the cake for some of those things and presented plenty of opportunity. What I like to mention a lot of times when I'm talking about transportation, though, is that contrary to popular belief sometimes, the Americans with Disabilities Act didn't really add to transportation. What it did was it said that existing transportation systems and programs had to provide transportation that was accessible to people with disabilities. And so that often is a little bit of a surprise to people because people expected that there was going to be more transportation. Well, that's not actually true. There should be more for people with a disability, but not necessarily more. As one person, I can't remember exactly who, said, it gives us access to the same lousy level of public transportation everybody else enjoys or doesn't enjoy, as the case may be. So with that backdrop, we'll talk a little bit about how it's been working in Idaho. Transportation's, Melva, you can address this too, I'm sure, is a little bit of a tricky animal because it's a complex funding stream. It requires local involvement, what we call local match, and really kind of a heavy administrative load at times with very specific money stream, particularly in Idaho, where there isn't any state money that goes in to support actual operations of transportation programs. Melva's with a arm of LINC that does transportation services under a couple of pots of money that are from the Federal Transportation Administration coming through Idaho Transportation Department. Which ones are you receiving funding from, Melva?
Right now, we're just receiving the 5310 money, and that is for people with disabilities and seniors. And that allows us to provide public transportation use on public transportation. We also contract with taxi providers to give people with disabilities and seniors a limited amount of rides to essential services, to doctors, to grocery stores, to whatever it might need. And it really allows people to maintain their residence in the community and not have to be institutionalized. It really is, transportation is such an important element in keeping people independent. You just can't live at home if you can't get out and get those essential services. So we're really excited to be able to do that here in Twin Falls and in the Magic Valley. We have been doing it for many years. We have seen funding go up, go down. It stayed pretty much the same in the last few years, but it's just not enough to really get into some of the smaller rural communities where we can't find providers because there is just not enough money for them to maintain a program. So, but transportation is an essential part of being independent.
Now, you mentioned 5310 funding, and that's one of the things that I was alluding to as well, is that it gets pretty complex. 5310 money is that money for people who are elderly and or have a disability. So kind of specific carve out of a population. You used to have the general public funding as well that came in, which is for everybody who wants to learn about transportation, is 5311. And that's for rural general public transportation, even though we would argue as people with the disability that we're members of the general public too. But you used to have that, so that's kind of gone away now.
We used to actually have 5316 and 17, which was reverse commute and job access. And that really helped because we were able to provide more rides than we are now, and that would help get people to work. And as you know, that if you don't have transportation, it's hard to get to work every day. And that was a real boost for people in our area for a while we had those funds.
No question about it. It's there's never enough. And as I mentioned, of course, the state doesn't fund the operations of public transportation. And so providers end up having to have local match. And in 5310 funding streams, that's a 20% local match,
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, it is.
Do you have folks pretty involved at the local level helping with that? Do you actually generate cash match? Are you doing kind of your time in kind? How exactly is that met locally?
We have been very blessed with a couple of our local organizations that have given us grant money to help make that match funds. The city of Twin Falls has been very generous and helped with that. But it is very, we have to go looking for it, and it is hard to find, but we haven't been able to make that match. But what LINC does is we pay for all of those administrative costs that you talk about, all of our salaries, all of the costs to run the program. LINC pays for. We do not get funding for that, and it comes out of our pockets. But we believe transportation is such an essential service that we're willing to do that. And fortunately, we have an organization that believes so much in providing that service for people with disabilities that we're willing to step up to the plate and make those, just make it happen.
Well, and I think I may have misspoke too, because you actually provide operations with 5310. So I think that's a 50% local match, if I'm not mistaken. So services is the 20%.
Right.
You're actually doing the services yourself. So I'm not sure. You're at the 20% or 50%?
We are at the 20 because we do not do any operationals. We contract everything out with taxis and with the local transfer, who is our public transportation provider.
Well, and as you stated, it's every time we've been to meetings, and I know we've been to plenty talking with people with disabilities across the country, one of the major barriers we've come up with housing, obviously, and transportation, and particularly in rural areas, because so much hinges on it. People needing to get to work, certainly in recreation and socialization, just being a part of the community and enjoying the other things that the Americans with Disabilities Act has made accessible, kind of hinges on being able to get someplace on accessible transportation. How do you deal with, you mentioned taxi cabs. So how do you deal with the accessibility? I'm assuming you don't have very many taxi companies that are lift equipped, but
No.
you have other providers that kind of fill in when there's an accessible need?
Yes, Transfor, who's our local public transportation, they have accessible vehicles. All of theirs are accessible. The taxis do what they can for people who can transfer, but we do not right at this time have anyone who has a lift-equipped vehicle. There's a lot of issues with that. If we try to get federal funding for that, then there's limitations on how that vehicle can be used. And it's just not too conducive for the taxi providers. But they do what they can to make those rides as accessible. But we work a lot with Transfor to get those accessible rides.
So you're operating really kind of what they would call a brokerage system. You're working with individuals and providing some funding to connect them with other transportation providers. It's very much in line with what the Association of Programs in Rural Independent Living had talked about in one of their programs dealing with rural public transportation. So an individual would connect with you and then...
Yes, once they connect with us and we determine that they are appropriate for our program, we give them a transportation card, which has all of the providers listed on it, and they would call one of the taxis or Transfor, set up the ride, and then they would go and pick them up, take them wherever they need to go, and then they bill us. The provider bills us for that ride, and then we kind of connect that loop. And but the person gets an accessible or affordable ride, depending on how far they go, is either free or has a very, very small copay.
Right.
And then they are able to connect with those services. And it's just, we find that people tell us all the time that without this card, they wouldn't be able to maintain their independence. It's not a lot of rides, but we work with other providers and help them use all of the different providers to the utmost benefit. So they might get a ride through the Medicaid dollars to a doctor's appointment, but then they could use our card to go get groceries or to go visit a friend or have that recreation that you're talking about, meet a friend for coffee. So we really help people try to maximize the use of the program. So they're not totally dependent on one particular program, and hopefully we can get them enough rides to get them through the month.
It's such a challenge, isn't it? Because the funding, as you mentioned, has kind of reduced. And as I talked about before, there are different pots of money. But in reality, Idaho's allotment of federal funds, because of the rural nature of Idaho in general, is very, very small. Communities like Boise, urban areas, some have kind of banded together. The Coeur d'Alene, Rathburn, and Post Falls area now is an urban area. They have access to some other federal funds, and so they're not really tapping into that rural piece. But that rural piece is a couple of $1 million statewide, or not a whole lot more than that. And so it doesn't need for a lot.
It doesn't. And we in Twin Falls is certainly soon will be going small urban. So that will also change the look of what happens in the next couple of years. So but we really need to get out into some of the smaller communities that really don't have, even the public transportation isn't there. And so we really need to be able to get out into those areas, but without the additional funding, it's just almost impossible.
There definitely are the diminishing returns, and some states fund transportation with a local options tax. For example, Washington State, you'll find different tax rates for different communities because the local population has said they want to fund some service for their residents or some project, whatever the case may be. And but Idaho doesn't allow for that, except really in one area that's taken advantage of that. And of course, that's up in Ketchum Sun Valley, where they have a fairly robust system, I think.
Very nice system up there.
Do you connect with them? So
they are starting to come to Twin Falls now. So they will, what we're hoping to do is if someone is able to use their system to get to Twin Falls, then maybe they can use our system to get around Twin Falls once they get here. So we are working with them on that to see if we can assist those folks to do that.
that's what's so key, that level of cooperation and collaboration, because often people who are looking to advocate for transportation increases tend to focus on the small provider and not recognize how different everybody is and how little money they have to deal with. And so sometimes it's that building relationships is the best way to approach it. And hopefully, I know we have it in our long range plan to participate on any kind of effort to allow for local options in communities, so that if a community wants to help support locally, they're able to do that. It's a challenge. We operate a system as well, and our funding is also Disability Action Center Northwest with $5310. It's a little bit different. We do kind of the same thing of buying services through a provider, but we actually do it through a single provider, and part of their program is to fund volunteer drivers. So people use their private vehicles and provide that service from out in most rural areas and get reimbursed for mileage. So that's kind of allowed us to expand a little bit beyond, but we have the same issue with respect to accessible transportation, where we have to come back and fund that accessible van, and happily do so, because that's what it's all about. But those vans are often pretty busy, helping transport for senior meal sites and things like that as well. So they're getting lots of use, but it's different ways of kind of stretching those dollars to make sure that rural states like Idaho have an opportunity to provide what we can. It's a fascinating and an interesting project, I think, and one that's so necessary. What do you see in the future? You mentioned the connections with Sun Valley, and then the potential small urban status of Twin Falls. I didn't realize that was coming forth.
Yes.
Do you anticipate? I know small urban areas get their own allotments often of $5310. So
yes.
Perhaps that's an opportunity for relationship building.
We work quite well with the city of Twin Falls. They've been very open to listening to the needs of folks about public transportation, and we're in the midst of starting an MPO, and that will help determine where transportation is going to go in the next 2 years. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen. I'm hoping for a lot of new things. I'm sure it's going to take a little while to get things moving, but as Twin Falls grows, I can just see I'm so hoping a fixed route will be in the near future, but that's my hopes and dreams. The smaller communities is what I really think is, once Twin Falls gets to receiving our own funds, then the outlining areas is where we're going to start focusing it, to see if we can get some providers out in those areas. Right. People in Buell and Jerome, they need to get to the grocery store just like everyone else. So it would be so great if we could have a provider in that area that we could contract with. So that's our focus, is once Twin Falls is gets their status changed, and so things will just keep going, and hopefully we can see some additional funding in the future. There's no guarantees on that. You know how that goes.
I do indeed. Yeah, it's such a huge challenge, because transportation, a lot of people tend to look at it, think of buses on fixed routes, but it's so much more. You talk these small communities, and it sounds like a lot of what you're doing is what the ADA would call demand responsive service. And it kind of has its own rules, but often it's the only thing that you can do. It's very hard to operate a fixed route where there's a very small ridership, and where the destinations and the pickup points are very diverse. So that'll be interesting to see what Twin Falls does with once it gets the funding and starts putting in fixed route systems. Because with fixed route under the ADA, then it triggers that thing called complementary paratransit. So they make sure they have those lift-equipped vehicles that can operate door to door or however their system defines it to ensure that people with any kind of disability have access to the system. And so they don't currently have a fixed route system.
We do not. No,
Okay.
it's a demand response.
Yep.
So it's so that's why it's really exciting to see, and not only for people with disabilities, but we have a large population of people now who are not driving. So that's why I get so excited about talking about fixed routes, is because I just know that there's a lot of folks who we have people coming in that do not drive. We have people with disabilities. Seniors are starting to, as you get a little older, you don't always want to drive, especially maybe at night.
Right.
And then we also have a younger generation who they may learn how to drive, but they don't see always a need to have a vehicle. So, there's things are changing a little bit. So people are more accepting and more have a desire to use public transportation more than they have in the past.
Well, and that's interesting you bring that up, and I really appreciate that, because one of the underpinnings of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the overarching principles, if you will, is integration. And so to have these pots of money in transportation that are basically segregating people who are elderly and or have a disability is almost counter to what we want to do. I always appreciated, again, I use the example of the state of Washington. I know in their state rules and regulations, they actually defined specialized transportation as transportation for those who need transportation. And so it wasn't based on a specific group. It could be a single parent with kids that need to go to school and they don't have a car to take them to school. That's specialized transportation and so on. And that really kind of fits more into what we've always been advocating for. So hopefully keep working as we move forward.
Yeah, we're changing from a society of, 2 cars in the garage and to, people who are more wanting to use bicycles, other transportation. They're walking more. As you know, we have bike paths and walking paths. And so to have a bus where they could maybe ride their bike somewhere and then take the bus the rest of the way, or maybe they ride their bike to work and then take the bus home and be able to bring their bike with them. There's just a lot of options now, and people are willing to do more than one thing just to get to work.
Wheelchair lift on the side and a bicycle lift on the back or the front. And I mean, you really are seeing that more and more in areas where there's a lot of outdoor recreation and people are more conscious of that. So there's hope for the future, I think, in terms of growth, and maybe little systems like ours actually being able to be integrated into a larger kind of network that's accessible to everybody. That's
what I'm hoping.
Yeah, me too. Well, it's just awesome. It's as I say, we could go on for a long time talking about transportation because it continues to be such a barrier for a lot of people. And the regulations in terms of ADA with complementary paratransit, sometimes those can be complex, but the bottom line is transportation is intended to be for everybody. And a lot of what we're facing has to do with that old issue of just not having enough transportation for anybody. Not just having inaccessible transportation. In actual fact, for what we have, we've done a fairly decent job, I think, of making that available, but we all need more.
We do, and to have it be, to longer hours of service, to weekend service, it would be great for everyone. So I'm always the one out there kind of beating the drum to make sure that we have transportation. And like we were talking about, it makes people, they're more independent, can stay in the community, all of that saves money in the long run. So,
and just kind of basically a good society for everybody, I think.
Yes, it is. Everyone's happy.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for connecting,
you.
and I would certainly encourage any of our viewers to contact Melva down in Twin Falls at the Living Independence Network Corporation offices. I'm sure you can go onto their webpage and find that contact information. Certainly welcome to contact me, Mark Leeper, up at Disability Action Center as well. Transportation is so important. It's complex. And what you'll often find when you dig into it is there's a whole bunch of little small providers that are really trying their darndest on a pretty small amount of money. And so any way we can get in and help with the advocacy and help with the support, I think can make a difference and ensure that it really does work for everybody. So,
Well, thank you, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, great fun.
All right.
Be well.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye.
A word collage in the shape of the United States with the word access highlighted and hashtag thanks to the ADA.